Blue wave, blue tide, not in Arkansas. Republicans retain every executive branch office and do it without breathing hard and keep the legislative almost as easily. The big bipartisan winners, the women who ran and the women who helped them. But there's one more race yet to be decided, a local campaign attracting statewide attention. All of it on Arkansas Week next.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Well, it's over. Perhaps not in some other states, but in Arkansas, the 18 campaign is done. Almost. Here it was another banner year for the grand old party, no question, and if a high-profile Republican legislator was unseated in northwest Arkansas, well, in the Delta, a lawmaker was defeated. He just happened to be the Democratic state chair. And in Arkansas and elsewhere, for women of both parties, it was a very good year. With all that, in Arkansas's capital city, the campaigns aren't over. Still, perhaps the lessons of this November are obvious, but perhaps not. That's for our roundtable. Heather Yates joins us from the Political Science faculty at UCA. Chris Hausnick from the Political Science staff at Arkansas Tech. Hal Bass up from Ouachita Baptist. And thanks to everybody for coming in. Republican dominance, Hal, in what was once one of the bluest states in the Union, if not the bluest, continues.
Sure, and continues comfortably there. Arkansas voters have become very attached to that Republican label. It doesn't show up necessarily in party ID proclamations, but if you look at the independent leaners, it does move decisively in that direction. And if you look at the outcomes, the Republicans running statewide ranged in their victories from against Democratic challengers from 60 to 65%, an incredibly narrow range there. If you look nationally at the Republican coalition, it's very easy to see why Arkansas is such a red state, because socioeconomically and demographically we fit the profile to a T. We're relatively rural, relatively older, at least in the South, relatively low minority presence, a large white working class component, relatively lower higher education attainment, a strong evangelical Christian presence. All of these are bullet points for the Republican coalition these days.
Yeah, let's look at the latest numbers we have. These are complete but unofficial. Let's take a look at the top of the ticket where Governor Hutchinson just easily won a second 4-year term. Just, well, it's 65 1/3% of the vote, Heather.
He was forecast to win handily. I think that one of the national forecasters had put about a handful of states in the 99.9% probability.
No surprises.
And so there was no surprise. And with as crimson as the state is, and with the popularity that Asa Hutchinson had been polled with, it was not surprising that Tuesday night that he sailed to victory, and he made an early victory speech, if I recall correctly, too. So it was an early night for many Republicans on Tuesday. So yeah, that race was not an upset, was not a surprise. Something that I do want to mention about that campaign, though, too, is while Asa Hutchinson came out on top, Jared Henderson won most of the counties that Hillary won in 2016, with the exception of Dacia County, which went for Asa Hutchinson. So that also suggests that the governor is popular around the state, and it's not nearly universal, but he is sweepingly popular, and so he also has a mandate, which if I recollect, on Tuesday he said he had a mandate in his victory speech. So.
Yeah, and a majority in both chambers to go with of the General Assembly. Chris?
Well, yeah, there's, the Republican Party's alive and well in Arkansas. There's some slight shifts and some slight changes. The Democratic Party is just not organized as well as universally. There are some, bright spots. They ran a very good race in the 2nd congressional district, but you're still losing. You won, 6 points is still a 6-point loss to French Hill. Whereas many of the other districts were, as Hal mentioned, you're losing by 30 points, 40 points. That's really hard to say, come follow us into battle against this majority, whereas in the 2nd, that's sort of the closest you can say to we're making progress. We had a serious campaign, we came really close, but a lot of the other parts of the state, you don't have that same kind of conversation.
Yeah, let's look at the numbers that we have also, since you brought it up, and that's the 2nd congressional district where Mr. Clark Tucker, was waging a very spirited campaign, and in comparison to earlier Democratic efforts in that district, a very well-financed campaign, holding Mr. Hill to about a 6-point victory, which was substantially less than he has scored in previous years. But of course, this was an off-year election too.
Sure, but Clark Tucker ran a very fine, credible campaign, but the arithmetic of the district simply works against him. It's Pulaski versus the rest. And if you just look at the numbers, there were somewhere around 250,000 votes cast in that race. Somewhere around 135,000 came from Pulaski County, where he won almost 60% of the vote. But of the 18,000 votes cast outside of Pulaski County, Hill won 67% of the vote.
Basically,
and that's the arithmetic.
We used to talk about the blue wall until 2 years ago. We talked about the blue wall in presidential politics, the Northeast and the upper Midwest and the Pacific Coast. Any Democrat running for Congress in the 2nd district in Arkansas is going to slam, and we have 5 elections now, consecutive elections, where this was manifestly obvious. You're going to hit a red wall, and you got to find some way to crack it. Nobody's been able to do it so far.
No, and based on, and I'd like to echo what Hal said too, because drilling down into what that district looks like, I mean, when you contrast Pulaski County to the other 6 counties, that's exactly what this contrast looks like. And it also reflects how sorted and polarized the parties are. Taking a look at just the precinct level data in Pulaski County, you see how the Democrats and the Republicans sorted along its diagonal through Little Rock along Highway 6, I think it was 167 and Highway 30, where Clark Tucker won the southeast portion of Little Rock and French Hill won the northwest portion of Little Rock. And so from the national theater all the way down to the precinct level data, we're also finding how polarized the voters are. So this really is a new theory that it's not just the political elites polarized, but it's now trickling down into the voters being polarized. And we see how Pulaski County is the more concentrated region where Democrats do very well for the reason that it's suburban, it's concentrated population, you have lower median incomes, all of those boxes that check off that Democrats do very well. But in terms of trying to reach out to the surrounding counties, which Clark Tucker visited all of those counties, it was not fruitful because he's up against all those very traditionalistic values that hold Republicans very strong as a voting bloc in the 2nd district. So in terms of what it's going to take, it's likely going to take a centrist Democrat who possibly doesn't have outside funding from the DCCC, making him an easy target to tie him to unpopular leadership.
Hal, you and I have been around long enough to remember when Saline and Faulkner had some of the strongest Democratic county organizations in the state.
The union movement was never very strong in Arkansas, but to the extent there was a base for it, it was Saline County.
Yeah.
It really was.
Yeah.
But to Heather's point, any Democrat trying to run in Arkansas in a competitive race is going to have a tough time doing what Arkansas Democrats used to be able to do, and that is separate themselves from the national party. Nationalization has made that strategy or that tactic very, very difficult to accomplish these days.
Yeah. Chris?
No, I agree with that. You see, with the French Hill campaign, they're bringing in Nancy Pelosi. You know, you're bringing a congresswoman from California into a Little Rock race and making it about her. That's the kind of idea that's become a bigger problem. And you
2
see
years
this,
ago, it was Obama. So you know,
yes,
before,
there's, you know, you're not just a a nice, good Southern Democrat from Arkansas. You are a Democrat in the Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi mold. Now, I think that mold can be broken. It's who's out there to break it, where you have to worry about, so what's the Democratic bench look like? Who is going to rise out of that? Now, it does happen spontaneously. You know, everybody's been talking about Beto in Texas. You know, he ran really well. The one you hear is Connor Lamb out of Pennsylvania, running in really red districts. He did well, and he won two House seats in two completely different districts because he got redistricted with Pennsylvania's redistricting plans. But finding one in Arkansas, there's very, very little depth in the bench. You know, who is out there is a pretty empty set right now.
Yeah, Hal, you've got some Texas ties. There was some demographic shifts too in Texas.
Certainly in Texas, while Beto ran short and didn't quite get up the hill, he ran a tremendously effective campaign to lose by only about 3 points in a state where a Democrat hadn't won in decades, statewide here. And he did excite enough voters to get the turnout up in a couple of congressional districts where, again, the socioeconomic, the demographic character of the district is such that you saw Democrats winning two districts, one in Houston area and one in the Dallas area, that have been represented by Republicans for literally 40 years.
Yeah, and I guess I took us to Texas just now to wonder out loud, although I doubt it, I don't see, Heather, any kind of demographic shifts in Arkansas that rival those that are taking place in Texas, save perhaps one, and that's urbanization.
Northeast Arkansas would be the location in this state where we're seeing demographic shifts. But to your point, correct, there's not that seismic demographic shift happening in the state. And to the point about strategy of O'Rourke's strategy that made him very competitive in that state was reversing what national strategy has been. It's connecting with voters. It's human relations. It's visiting every single county that O'Rourke had started at the top of the year to visit every single county, shake hands. It's old school. It's the retro strategy, right? You know, getting out, shaking hands, talking to people, talking to all people, talking to Republicans, talking to Democrats, talking to independents. And I think that could be a lesson learned for the 2nd Congressional District here in Arkansas is what's the strategy look like? Because there were two things that played against Tucker in this district. One was the triple seat establishment. The second was the Hollywood connection with Mary Steenburgen coming to Arkansas in early fall to campaign on behalf of Clark. And so French Hill saw an opportunity to create that ad that tied him to the Hollywood apparatus as well too. So I think what can be learned from other states around it, and I'm also thinking about the Georgia 6th district that just changed hands. Last year the special election ran Democrat Ossoff, which lost to Republican Handel. It changed hands again with a first-time candidate, a novice to the scene. So it might take a Democratic centrist, a new political face, not tied to the state apparatus, not tied to the national apparatus, and maybe revamping the old FDR coalition, the agrarian coalition.
Yeah, these are all candidate-related issues, which are obviously important. But there's something more fundamental in the 2nd district, and that is that the suburbs in the 2nd district are atypical of suburbs
elsewhere.
Because Democrats have made nationally and in Texas some great strides in the affluent suburbs, and that's just not happening in central Arkansas here. To the extent it is happening in Arkansas, and this is a tremendous irony, it's happening up in northwest Arkansas.
And we'll go there in just a second. Let's do some other statewide business first. There was an Arkansas State Supreme Court race on the ballot. This one was marked by litigation, a flood of outside money, not that was that particularly unusual, and also the fact that the incumbent, Justice Goodson, who managed to prevail over Mr. Sterling, didn't do much in the way of paid media of any kind until the very last days of the campaign. Chris?
Well, I think that's it's one of the, you actually have, local elections. It's supposed to be nonpartisan, supposed to be with a lot of winks, nods, and but you're seeing, when we talked about this before, you're seeing these sort of big money outside efforts. They've started at the national level. They have come down to the local election. They're coming down to judicial elections, and that's really changing the nature of them. We can imagine what the result of that judicial election might have been if outside groups came in, say, in September rather than towards the later half of October.
No.
What I was going to say was that the race is technically nonpartisan. Sterling did all he could to make it effectively partisan, and the outside money encouraged that as well. But the point I would make is that in terms of Arkansas voter behavior, apparently you need to have the R next to the name for that partisan voting to kick in. If you look at the Supreme Court race, and if you look at the ballot issues, at least two of them, you saw voter behavior that did not fit the ideologically conservative mode. And there's a lesson there, it seems to me, for Democrats in terms of trying to win in a state where the partisan tides are running in the other direction.
Let's look at the numbers real quick on those statewide issues, the three that survived to make the ballot, or at least to be tabulated anyway for the ballot. We had, what's first? Let's call them up. Here's casino gambling, and Chris, we're going to go to you in just a second. It passed by about 9 points, and it won in it failed conspicuously in one of the counties, in the 4 counties that were authorized under this amendment to get it, and that's yours.
Yep. Pope County voted overwhelmingly. They passed a local ordinance saying we must have another vote for whatever proposal comes in. We were discussing this. This is one of those great proposals everybody loves, but don't build it in my backyard. We want to go to Russellville to gamble. That's, if you're in Conway, great. I love the idea of a casino 45 minutes away, but not in Conway.
Yeah.
Now the local politics is going to get really into it. The developers, the gaming companies, et cetera. Because to this point, it is an election, and it's a theoretical exercise. Unlike other places, like Hot Springs, like West Memphis, they have existing casinos. Now somebody's going to actually have to say, this is what we want to construct.
Here.
Yes, in this location with this many jobs, and that is where this story will continue on for the foreseeable future.
Okay, another look at an amendment, and I'm not sure which one we've got up next. Okay, minimum wage. We all thought this one would sail, and it did.
In spite of the opposition from the economic conservatives, from the Arkansas Chamber of Commerce, who argue it's going to be a job killer here.
And it's my understanding that that was the only opposition that had organized against the ballot issue, if I recall correctly. And it's also a good demonstration, to your point, about how minimum wage is a progressive Democratic issue, but without the party signature next to it. Okay, this is where voter behavior, Arkansans will vote for very progressive issues, but at the same time then vote for very conservative persons on the ballot. So it's always interesting to see how the chips fall on ballot issues when we're talking about party ID.
Yeah, put minimum wage on the ballot and it'll sail. Okay, and that leaves us with, what do we got next? Okay, voter ID. Wow. No surprise there either, Hal.
The belt and suspenders amendment.
Yeah, basically an 80-20 split.
We've got a law.
Yeah.
All right.
A law that's gotten the Supreme Court sanction that does what the amendment does.
Gender. I guess we'll start with Dr. Yates on this one. How are you? It really went. It was a year for women.
It was another year for women outside of 1992. We had a record of number of women running at the national level. We had a record number of women running at the Arkansas level. And on both state and national level, women ran, they were engaged, they volunteered, they mobilized, and women won. And Arkansas will have the largest cohort outside of the one that was elected in 2009, serving in the Arkansas state legislature. There will be now upwards of almost a third of the state legislature, 7 women senators, and that leaves my math is failing me, but upwards of about 26 or so state legislatures. So 25, if I just look at my notes, 25 women serving in the state house. So at the national level, we have an increase of, let's say, almost a quarter of the congressional Congress will be women. 121 women were elected. And the breakdown is still representative of the what I'll call ideological or partisan gap. 101 of those women who are newly elected at the national level are Democratic and 19 were Republican. At the state level in Arkansas, that looks a little more diverse. The women represent more of a diversified ideological spectrum, so we don't have that stark split. But we also know that having more diversity at the table will produce, in theory, more comprehensive public policy.
What brought this on in 2018? Can you point to some factors that?
I think there's a couple of factors. Nationally, there's been a couple of things that have been identified. One, it's some view it as an anti-Trump sentiment. Others view it as a backlash to sexual harassment in the workplace. And I think in Arkansas, it's a combination of things because we also have very conservative women who are running. And so the conservative candidates that we have on the ballot are not anti-Trump sentiment and are not a backlash against a lot of the public sentiments out there. But what we do see is in Arkansas at the state level, I do point to the year 2008. I do point to Sarah Palin as this, the lagged Palin effect of how Sarah Palin redefined what Republican feminism is. And it's this kind of hybrid or intersectionality of women's issues with conservative tradition. And Sarah Palin showed that it could work. And Arkansas has more women that are representing that mold. And so I think we have both of those factors at play in Arkansas. And I think with the president who he is also generating a great deal of enthusiasm in the independent and Democratic side of the aisle to, one, pay attention to politics. I think a lot of people woke up to civic engagement and just civics in general. And once they started paying attention, realized that they wanted to do something about it. And that for some women, that was to run for office. For other women, it was to campaign for a woman running in office. So we saw an uptick on women. We saw an uptick on youth. A lot of 18 to 24-year-olds were, I guess, energized to civic engagement. So I'd say in Arkansas, it's a hybrid of those elements. And so in each state is going to have different reasons as to why they saw more increased activity. But I would point to those two for Arkansas.
Finally tonight, Arkansas's capital city choosing a new mayor, 5 candidates, and of the top 3 presumed frontrunners, nobody knew how it was going to shake out. Well, now we do. We've got a runoff coming in basically about 2 weeks. Mr. Scott, Mr. Kurrus.
And the issues before us here, as we look toward that December 4th runoff, turnout is obviously key. Anytime you've got a special election, particularly a nonpartisan special election, it is very, very difficult to organize such a, in a setting like that. You've got to ask the question, will Warwick Saban, who narrowly ran 3rd, will he make an endorsement, and will it make a difference? And the other question is, to what extent will race be a significant factor in voting behavior? It was in the, at least it was a correlation, a strong correlation in the election on Tuesday. Will that carry forward? Again, looking back to the early days of after the voting rights revolution, African American candidates and their supporters had real issues with runoffs as a concept, because there was a perception that in a 2-person race pitting an African American against a white, the African American would be at a distinct disadvantage. And you hadn't heard as much about that in this century as you did in the latter, years of the 20th century. But I think that's gonna be on the table going forward.
Yeah, Chris, quickly.
I have to agree with Hal. A lot of these runoff elections, it's getting supporters back to the polls.
Back to, yeah.
And we're having a lot of the mayor races, things of that up our network. They've gone to runoffs as well. And then, hey, we had 10,000 people vote in the first round. Can you get to 5,000 show up in the second round? That's the kind of effort that's going to really sort of separate things. And now in a place like Little Rock, because it is much more concentrated, that might be a little bit easier. But a lot of it is turnout.
Yeah. Heather, you get the last shot at it.
That is something that I want to echo, is that runoff elections are always tricky because you've got to re-energize your voters to turn out.
Motivate.
And it's turnout, and it's targeted turnout.
Yeah. Got to end it there because we're out of time. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next week.
Local broadcast of Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the award-winning Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, Arkansas's largest major newspaper, bringing you local, national, and international news since 1819. By the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.